915 Talk is a production of Desert Voice Media. You can visit desertvoice.media to learn more.
915 TALK.
The world is looking at El Paso.
What will we say to the world? From the KELP studio in El Paso, this is 915 Talk.
And now your host.
Good afternoon, beautiful citizens of the borderland. This is 915 Talk, and I am your host, Andy Frecka. We are broadcasting from the heart of the world's largest borderplex from the KELP studio here in El Paso. And today we have Mac Daddy Del Norte on the board. Mac Daddy, how you doing?
Yes, I'm doing good, Andy. And yourself?
I'm doing all right.
Good.
Yeah, we're going to be talking history today, Mac Daddy.
Oh, my favorite subject.
Yeah, and you know, I think we need to have our special guest talk to you. So
Definitely.
First, what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce our special guest.
Okay.
And then I'm going to have you have a little conversation with him.
Okay.
Because I think you need to hear from him. According to artificial intelligence, the best historian to ever have on the radio. And we've had him before. Last time we talked about the Blue Whistler Cannon. We talked about a World War I vet from El Paso who is definitely deserving of a Medal of Honor.
Mm-hmm.
Today we're going to be talking about Juan de Oñate, who is really a historical figure who shaped our lives here today on the border. And then we're going to be talking about a couple of religious groups, the Jewish people and also Mormons, and kind of their migration back and forth between Mexico and the United States. Okay. And it's always a lively conversation with this guest, always fun, but also always super informative. I believe that we need to understand our past in order to understand what's going on today, and also to understand the best way forwards for our communities. So without further ado, let's give a very warm Borderland welcome to the one, the only, Mr. Bernie Sargent. Bernie, welcome to 915 Talk.
Thank you again. Once again, I had a great time last time chatting with you guys. It's always fun because it's lighthearted, but it's somewhat factual.
Right.
I've discovered over the years. So we try to keep it loose and fun and enjoyable.
Of course.
Like most of us would like to have had our history teachers teach in that fashion. That keeps our attention.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Keeping history lessons maybe a little bit lighthearted, just so that they don't become too dry. Keep them engaging so that we can remember these important moments from our past. So Bernie, I have some news for you.
Okay.
Mac Daddy Del Norte confessed to me last time that his favorite subject is not history. And so what would you say to someone who struggles with history, with finding the importance in it?
Well, keeping in mind he's using a fictitious name, that's a lot right there.
Oh man,
he's an obscurity. What can I say? History is kind of an interesting thing. When I was in school, I liked history, but I just didn't like the way it was being taught, and just kind of set the stage for as I was going through school and being educated in California. 2 strikes against me. The teaching out there was textbook teaching, and it wasn't stuff that was interesting. They wanted to know where the clouds were at the time of day when something had occurred, and I didn't care where the clouds were. What occurred? And then who was involved with this whole thing? So Mac Daddy, alias Mac Daddy.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm so I don't know. If I'd have known this ahead of time, I might not have said I'll be here. I might have stayed at the doctor's office instead.
Oh no.
Yeah, but I think it's an interesting point that you make, Bernie, is that history is not just a list of dates that we memorize. It's stories about people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So we're going to talk today about one of the most controversial, maybe, figures in history here in the borderland, and it's Juan de Oñate. And what I love about doing this program is so much of what we talk about, I'm only vaguely aware of. And this is no exception. I know he was like the first conquistador, late 1500s, came from Spain. I know that there was a lot of, well, even to this day, people view him in different ways. But where would you start when you were talking about Juan de Oñate, Bernie?
Well, Oñate, I think, was a product or a byproduct of the era that he lived. He was born in Mexico, in Zacatecas, and born of a fairly noble family. And he ultimately ended up marrying the great-granddaughter of Montezuma, or great-great-granddaughter of Montezuma.
Oh, wow.
His family was related to the original settlers of Mexico, what we now know as Mexico. And then he married into the hierarchy of Mexican deity. And so he had a lot of ties to that. Plus, at that particular time, if you wanted to be a noble and you weren't the oldest son in the family, you had to earn it. So all of the adventures that he undertook initially, he had to pay out of his own pocket.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was an interesting time to live, but he was bound and determined to make a name for himself, which he did. And like you alluded to, some people don't think it's such a nice name, or things that occurred during his travels through what we now know as New Mexico, situations that occurred, didn't really set well with the people, more so of today than back then, because it was the way things were handled back in the day was a lot different than what they would do today when he ran up against the situation. If you compare, for instance, if you talk about Sharia law, we're talking about a different religion totally. You steal, they cut your hand off. You don't steal again. If you lead a rebellion against Oñate and his group, one of the things that were shared with people and handed down over time was the people that instigated the situation that created animosities between the Acoma tribes and Oñate. He rounded up some of the ringleaders and cut off their right foot so that they couldn't lead more uprisings. Now, he might have done that. I mean, it was all passed down mouth to mouth over time. If it happened, it was horrible, but that doesn't necessarily mean it was something that was not done back in the day, to handle situations like that. Plus, he was motivated because his nephew had traveled to the Acoma Mesa, and at the time, Oñate had heard of previous travelers through that area and how they had established a relationship with that particular tribe, and they were welcomed. They had a feast. Things were very amiable. But when Oñate's nephew went up there, the Acomas slaughtered the soldiers. I mean, they walked in going, "Hey, they're going to welcome us. Nope, now you see them, now you don't." So that that certainly didn't sit well with Oñate. But again, what happened after that, horrible, but maybe it was a sign of the times, and such, wouldn't happen today.
Yeah, that's, I think, possibly the most infamous thing he did, or as you're saying, allegedly did, was cut off these Indian or Native Americans, 1 foot of each person involved in the uprising. I had heard from someone that Native Americans in El Paso, when they heard an Oñate statue was going to be put up, they threatened that they would cut off his foot, because it's still very fresh in their mind. But moving back.
If I could throw this out, the interesting thing about that, I was at that commemoration when they dedicated the statue, which is the largest bronze statue of its kind in the world. And John Hauser, who did that particular statue, took great pride in what he was doing and tried to make it as intricate and as close to resembling Oñate as he possibly could, based on information passed down over ages. Now, the folks that showed up there at the particular dedication at the airport, a lot of them were from New Mexico territory, New Mexico. And when we talked with the Acoma tribal leaders, they said they did not sanction these people to come down here and create this situation. So it wasn't driven by the leadership of the Acoma tribe. It was young tribal members or friends of tribal members who instigated the whole thing.
Right. So, yeah, for those who don't know, maybe they've never been to the El Paso airport. The El Paso airport has this giant statue out front. You say it's the largest bronze statue of its kind in
in
the
the world.
world?
Mhm.
Yeah. Wow. And that does show just Oñate's significance, regardless of how you view the history, to the region. The El Paso airport, the port for our area has a giant statue of Oñate out front.
Mhm.
So it is interesting. And so you were there at the dedication, and there were some people who came down from that tribe, and they were displeased.
There was a handful of them. Yeah, I think there
Yeah.
was 5 or 6 people from the tribe, and then there was local people that were caught up in the momentum of that situation. So uh,
Mhm.
they spoke their piece. I think the statue says a lot about the area and a lot about Oñate and his influence on the area, going back to 1598, when actually it was in April, so it's pretty significant that they celebrated La Toma, or the dedication of the area north of the Rio Grande River, about the same, pretty close to Easter. And so they actually, he had at one point when they reached the banks of the river, and after they finished praying thanks after living 3 or 4 days without any food or water, traveling across the desert, he was thankful that he and the 500 or 600 people that were traveling with him, and the thousands of heads of sheep and cattle and so on that they brought along, had made it that far. And
Wow.
he actually took his shirt off, exposed his back, so he could atone for his sins. And they would whip you to alleviate sin. It was just a tradition back then. So I'm glad they don't do it now, because boy, confession would not be very popular in the Catholic.
so so he was traveling with a group of 500 or 600 people.
Yeah.
Okay, so I always picture like a conquistador with a group of like 30 soldiers, but this is something
No, they had
much larger.
well over 200 soldiers, plus the soldiers. A lot of them had their wives and family with them. There were probably, I'm reading different counts, but 30 to 50 Franciscan monks, because one of their missions was to convert the natives they meet up with to Catholicism on the way.
Hmm.
And it would stretch out at times. That whole procession would be 2 to 3 miles long, because they would straggle out.
Wow.
That's a lot of a lot of attendees, so to speak. And
Yeah, yeah.
well, the first thing they did is they wanted to take a straight route, which would have taken them right across the Chihuahuan Desert. And when they got to the Concho River, it was overflowing, and they could get across. In fact, Oñate got on his horse because people were kind of afraid of trying to cross it, and he rode across the Concho and stood on the banks the other side and said, "Follow me." But they realized that the sheep had not been sheared, so they would have drowned if they were to cross the river with that heavy wool coat.
Right.
So what they did is they got the wagons across. They took all the wheels off the wagons, and they created a bridge by tying the wheels together, so that the sheep could walk across the bridge to get
Oh
a
wow.
north side of the Concho River. And then they proceeded to travel north all the way to the Rio Grande River. About the area just a little bit south and east of San Elizario, at the end of a road called Chicken Ranch Road. That's where they had intended to cross. Actually, that's where they camped. And at that time, the Rio Grande River was actually on the south side of where it is now.
Right.
It changed directions over the years. So that's where they set up their first encampment and spent a few days there celebrating getting to the Rio Grande River, and sent a handful of their best swimmers, as he referred to them, downriver or upriver, as the case would be, where they ultimately found a narrow area where they could cross, and that's in the area where the Hacienda restaurant sits right now. That's where they crossed into now what is known as Texas and New Mexico.
Wow. Right there at the Hacienda restaurant.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have the privilege of knowing the folks at an organization called Abara.
Mhm.
That they now own the Hacienda restaurant, or run it there. It's not a restaurant anymore, but they're doing border awareness, and right there where that first crossing was made. So that's pretty interesting, pretty significant. It's an interesting place to visit right there, because It's one of the few pieces of privately owned property that's right up against the wall in El Paso. So interesting that happened right there. I feel like they told me that when I was at Ibarra, but I must have forgotten about it. But for those who don't know, it's just down over the hill across the highway from UTEP, essentially, is where they crossed. So Bernie, let's back up a little bit. My very vague understanding of Oñate is he is a Spanish conquistador, but you're saying he was born in Mexico.
Yes.
Okay. And I like what you said. I think it's interesting for us to remind ourselves just this idea that when we look back at history, the people involved in those stories were looking through a different filter, a different prism than we do today.
Oh, yeah.
And Oñate was going as a Spanish conquistador. And the way you read things, was he more motivated by faith, a sense of ambition? What was his driving force? Like, why would he try to lead 500 or 600 people to a very high risk situation?
It's well, it was faith, had a lot to do with it, but I think it was more of a personal motivation. The riches that he could derive from finding these cities of gold that were talked about by early explorers. They figured he'd bring riches back. He'd take riches back to Mexico, and he'd be very famous because of that. Plus, very wealthy. And it didn't kind of work out that way, because while he was up there, it was 1606. Well, 1598 is when they crossed into this area. 1606, he was actually laying out the plans for what we now know as Santa Fe. And that's when he was called back to Mexico to stand trial for the things that that he did. And he was ultimately fined. I'm looking for my notes here. I got too many notes. Here they are. 6,000 ducats. Yeah. Now, ducats is a term that's being used now in the Bitcoin world, but back then it was a monetary exchange coin. And he was fined 6,000 ducats. And when I did a little research this morning, that's each ducat was 3.5 grams of gold.
Oh, wow.
So in today's monetary value, he was fined $2,175,000 for what he did. Now, ultimately, he was found not guilty of a lot of the offenses that they tried him on, and then went back to Spain, where he was made the chief inspector for all of the mines in Spain. So they kind of forgot about, or I should say, negated a lot of the things that he was tried on, and made him somewhat of a local hero back in Spain.
Wow. I have so many questions about this. But first, we're going to take a break. If you just joined us, we're with historian Bernie Sargent. Always a fun conversation to learn about these people, their people, and these stories from the past here in the borderland, here in West Texas and New Mexico. And I can't think of really a more influential figure than Juan de Oñate, who we're talking about right now. We're going to go into a break. This is just your daily reminder that if you want to listen to this conversation again, or any of our past conversations, you can go to desertvoice.media. That's the website, desertvoice.media, and look for that 915 talk link. Again, that's desertvoice.media. We really appreciate you joining us for these 915 talk conversations each weekday afternoon here in the heart of the world's largest borderplex. We're going to go into a break. Do not touch that dial.
We'll be right back. Don't touch that dial.
915 Talk is listener supported and is a production of Desert Voice Media. That's right. It's people just like you who make this program possible. Together with Desert Voice, you can learn how to better serve our neighbors and pray for our community. To become a Desert Voice Media partner, you can visit desertvoice.media. That's right. That's the website, desertvoice.media. Take a look and join us today in reaching our borderland for Christ.
We're back. You're listening to
And we're back. You're listening to 915 Talk. I'm your host, Andy Frecka. Today we're with historian Bernie Sargent, and we're discussing Juan de Oñate. There were people possibly in Oñate's party who were looking to undermine him, maybe because they had ambitions of their own. And so they were sending complaints back to Mexico. Is that kind of what you're saying? Possibly?
That would be my guess. I've not read anything that substantiates that, but intrigue was always abundant in those days. Everybody had aspirations of grandeur, and they would be trying to do their best to figure out, now how can I supplant him and put myself in that position? And I don't like what I see. Oh, there's my opening. We can get rid of this guy and we can take over.
Yeah, but nonetheless, it is interesting that they knew that their actions would be scrutinized back in Mexico, because my whole, I don't know, feeling about history has been that the colonizer government would not care about those actions, but there definitely seems to be some level of concern if they're ready to take them to court over it.
Yeah, and what did they say? I mean, what were all the charges? I've not read all the charges against him.
Right.
There might have been some fabrication. I don't know. I would tend to believe that if they really were ambitious about removing him as governor, they would get very grandiose with their charges. And who's going to question them?
Yeah, sure. So he was called back to Mexico. Remind me what year?
1606.
1606. So Mac Daddy Del Norte. This is why we memorize dates. So
Yes.
so
There's only a few that I try to remember. My
Right.
wife's birthday being probably the most important.
And that's the one you forget.
yeah.
I
So
always forget that one.
yeah.
I keep saying, why weren't you born on the 11th of July? And I could say 7/11. I could remember that.
right. So, but he left on his journey in 1598. He was
Mhm.
called back 8 years later.
Yeah.
What would the timeline be of those 8 years? Like, how long did it take him to reach the north of New Mexico? What did he accomplish during that time?
Well, they would have reached that area upwards of Santa Fe probably close to 1600. And I know that he set up a couple more explorations looking for the cities of gold, and one of which was heading in a easterly direction throughout what we now know as New Mexico territory, possibly getting into parts of Oklahoma, and then heading back again, but not finding the golden cities that they were hoping for.
Right. So that first journey took well over a year.
Mhm.
He has 500 or 600 people with him. I would think that those soldiers taking their families, the idea was, I don't know if I'm ever coming back again, so you're coming with me.
Yeah, true. Well,
Yeah.
there was a lot of these folks weren't planning on going back to Mexico. They were going to make the new area their home, and they would have sections of land that would be allocated to them so that they could ranch or farm. So it's something they wouldn't have had in Mexico.
Yeah.
So there was opportunity there in lieu of payment.
Yeah, it's so interesting because, of course, now in the year 2025, if I go anywhere, I look up pictures of it online. I want to look at reviews. I want to know what I'm getting myself into. They had no idea what they were getting themselves into. And
Not
here they go. The idea was go north and you'll get some land, possibly in a golden city, or
yeah.
or possibly you'll die. More likely the second option.
Or die. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And a lot of the people they brought along were experts like blacksmithing, things like that, because they wanted to take that expertise with them into the New World.
Right. Wow, that's amazing. So he was up in Santa Fe. What was he just like? I don't want to say just establishing missions, but was that what he ended up accomplishing?
Well, that was one of them. Yeah, they needed to set up a capital, so to speak. Along the way, they were building churches, and
Okay.
they would some of the Franciscan monks would stay at those churches and continue proselytizing the natives. and he ultimately got to Santa Fe. That's from what I've read, that was his ultimate destination, as far north as he wanted to go.
Okay.
And they started putting up churches in that area. They started trying to proselytize the natives, and I think he had plans ultimately to branch out somewhat. But then he was called back to Mexico to stand trial, and there were a number of charges. There were quite a few charges against him, and he only was found guilty on 6 charges. I forgot to mention that.
Okay.
So, yeah, that tends to solidify my feeling that people were just throwing stuff against the wall, hoping it would stick and get him out of there.
Right. Well, as I think I mentioned to our listening audience almost every time we're on air, I spent many years living in Russia, and there's a Russian phrase, there's no smoke without fire. So I would think that some things were not exactly kosher that he was doing, or exactly right, but maybe not to the extent that history has made it out at times.
And to that end, some people carried matches with them, so they created a fire.
Exactly. So what do you see as being Oñate's legacy?
I think the legacy is the exploration of the area, the documentation of the various tribes that they met along the way, mapping the area for future usage, and creating opportunity for people to move into this particular area. And it was kind of copacetic until 1690, when the tribes, the new numbers of tribes gathered together and actually chased the Spanish / Mexicans out of the area, and they had to retreat down to Paso del Norte. That lasted for about 6 years, and then the military put together a number of soldiers, and they marched north, and they defeated the natives once again. And then that's when things settled down going forward, and the missions were established, the presidios, and so on, going along the Rio Grande River.
Right. So yeah, and just a reminder to ourselves and to our listeners that this was all pre-pilgrims.
By 22 years.
Yeah, and so there was a lot of history happening in the future United States before what I learned in Ohio in history class. As a matter of fact, growing up in Ohio, it was very much an expansion from the east going west. That's what we learned in most history classes. But this is different. It's from the south going north.
But things didn't change over the years, because living in East Texas now, many generations of Texians or Texans didn't think there was anything going on in the far west of what we now know as Texas.
Right.
And so I've spent a little bit of time here trying to educate the locals on, you talk about the El Camino de los Teos. We have an older one that's longer.
Yeah.
And we have missions in a presidio that are older than what you're bragging on here. So the knowledge, again, you grew up were born in Ohio. I was born in Pennsylvania. So all we knew was the Quakers and the Pilgrims. That was the basis of our history, and the War of 1812 on Lake Erie. That was it. And Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, and the Battle of Toledo, which was between Ohio and Michigan. Ohio did win.
Toledo, they won.
Yeah. But Oñate ends up going back. He stands on trial. He goes back to Spain, which I guess he went to for the first time, probably, and ends up being an inspector in their mining system.
Yeah, he ran the mines for the Spanish government. So they obviously didn't hold a grudge against him. They felt he was worth doing something and worth having around.
Yeah, I mean, he definitely showed some ambition. I mean, New Mexico is a large state, even when you're driving a car. And stopping in Santa Fe is dangerous even today. But back then it took a lot longer and was a lot more perilous, of course, than now. So quite a legacy. I think it is good for us to be reminded that, just about history, that just what we said at the beginning, that we see it through a different prism now than people did back then.
Mhm.
And if anyone's listening and you're super upset about the way that we're discussing this, I love the passion. Be sure to put that in the comments section in Facebook or on the 915 Talk YouTube channel. Would love to hear that. Uh, I love hearing all the different voices on these matters, just so we can learn more about the place that we live.
Interesting thing you mentioned, the dissension amongst people today for what occurred back then. I respect them for that passion. I really do.
Mhm.
And I've had discussions with people about slavery amongst the Indians because the Spanish and Mexicans did take advantage of the natives, but the natives were not innocent with regards to slavery. The Yakimas had a number of slaves from other tribes that they kept to do their hard labor, and other
Right.
tribes were the same way. So
Yeah.
it's mankind has this incredible capacity to look at other people's faults and not their own.
Absolutely. It's almost as if all have sinned.
Yeah,
Without exception.
yeah, yeah.
So that is good for us to be reminded of. Let's switch gears for a bit. You were telling me about the Mormon Exodus of 1912.
Mhm.
Okay, so tell me about the Mormon Exodus of 1912.
Okay, that happened mainly because there was a law passed in the United States that forbid marriage plurality. In other words, a man can't have more than one wife. And
Right.
as most people know, the Mormons early on, that was a very standard practice. So what they were doing is they were looking for a place where they could live and they could practice the plurality in a relationship. And they
Right.
ended up in Mexico doing that. And they had something like 9 communities down in Mexico across the border from Juarez south. And they moved down there, took their wives with them, and practiced initially quite freely that plurality of marriage. And they set up some great facility or villages down there. They were excellent farmers. They knew what they were doing. In fact, in Mexico City, invited the Mormon leadership down to Mexico City for what they branded as a World's Fair to teach other Mexicans how to irrigate and how to plant, do all the things that the Mormons were so good at doing in Mexico. And so they did this, and it was really popular. Well, unfortunately, along came the revolution with Pancho Villa and the Federales. And Pancho Villa was looking for ammunition, he was looking for food, he was looking for horses, all of which the Mormons had in all of their communities. And the Federales, they wanted the weapons and they wanted recompense. They wanted some money to help fund their situation. So you had the two factions battling, and the Mormons were in the middle. So they were left with no choice but to leave or lose everything, and they didn't want to do that again. So they decided they wanted to go north. Well, the United States felt for them, and they sent trains down to ship them the wives and children to the United States. Meanwhile, the men were smuggling their cattle and so on up through New Mexico territory into the United States. New Mexico had just become a state in 1912, and that's when this exodus took place. They were so warmly welcomed in El Paso that folks, there was a lumber yard where they had the bins for the lumber. They converted that to a makeshift hotel, so to speak, where they could stay temporarily. The Army sent their band in to perform and entertain them. It was just they were just so warmly received that quite a few of the Mormons just decided this is where they're going to call home, and they stayed here. And they built their stake centers, and they grew their community, became very much part of the El Paso community going forward.
Also, so they didn't many of them did not continue up to Utah. They just stayed here in El Paso.
Some went back up to Utah, but a
Right.
lot of them stayed here. Yeah, they were given train tickets to go to Utah if they wanted to go.
Yeah, how interesting. What a history. And and I think, for younger people listening to something like this, it seems like distant history, but this wasn't that long ago. I mean, 1912, my grandfather was alive. He wasn't very old, but he was alive. I think he was born in 1911, and just a couple generations ago, really, that this was happening, where these Mormons were smuggling their cattle up across the river and making a new life here. And New Mexico had only recently become a state. So Yeah, I love it. I love hearing all these interconnected stories, Bernie.
Oh, it's amazing how so much is tied together. It's just so fascinating. An interesting story that ties into another discussion we can have in another program, and that is as the Mormon faith gained strength in the east of the United States, many of the other religions were not very happy with that particular religion, and they were very intimidated by it, and the way that they vanquished the Mormons sometimes is very inhuman. Again, we're going back to what we talked about with Oñate, and they were chasing them west to where there was no population. Well, they were in an area of what is now called Liberty, Missouri, and Liberty was one of the oldest counties, one of the oldest established cities west of the Mississippi. And the Mormons thought, well, this is where we need to be. And so they set up their village, their community there, and immediately ran into problems with all the other religions. In fact, it was such an ugly relationship that the governor of Missouri had decided that his name was Boggs. He decided that the leadership of the Mormon Church had to be eradicated. You know, the old saying, you cut off the head of the snake. And there was a gentleman who served in the Missouri National Guard, State Guard, because at that time there was no national army. There was a lot of nervousness in the United States about having one big army controlled by one central government. And that was predicated on the experiences they had with England. And so they said, well, if we need military assistance for any reason, we'll depend on the militias within the states. So Missouri had a militia, and one of their leaders, one of their commanding officers, was a guy by the name of Alexander Donovan. And if you live in El Paso, which most listeners do, you'll be familiar with the name Donovan Drive.
Yes.
West El Paso. Well, Donovan was, I think, second in command of the militia, and he was given a directive to disperse with the leadership of the Mormon Church, a polite way of saying eliminate them, not chase them, eliminate them.
Wow.
And he just refused. He didn't want any part of that particular action, and it wasn't well received by the governor. But in the meantime, they locked up the leadership of the Mormon Church, and they had them in jail in Liberty for about going on almost 6 months. And it was not a very pleasant jail. There was 5 or 6 of the leaders that they had in there. Brigham Young was one, and they had them in the basement of the jail. And it was very low profile. And one of the jailed leaders of the Mormon Church was a 6'6" tall deacon. And he forever suffered back problems after he finally got out of jail because of the fact that he was always stooped over in this particular environment.
Wow.
And so it was a pretty nasty situation. And in the meantime, there was one of the children of one of the prisoned Mormon leaders was accused of plotting to kill Governor Boggs. And so he was arrested. And the jail, interestingly enough, was right across the road from where Alexander Donovan lived. And Donovan not only was one of the leaders of the militia, he was also an educated lawyer. He was educated at Transylvania University in Kentucky, and ironically, the same school that Stephen F. Austin went to. Different time period, and a few years later, but it's the same college. But so anyway, Donovan was asked if he would defend the son or the kid that was accused of plotting to kill Governor Boggs, and he did, and he got him released. And in the interim, managed to convince, along with a couple other people, the Mormon church or Mormon supporters and religious followers to leave Missouri. And that's when they embarked on the trip that ultimately took them to Salt Lake City. And the Mormons were so appreciative of Alexander Donovan's leadership and what he did for them that there's a statue in Salt Lake honoring him, and there's plaques and statues in Missouri honoring Alexander Donovan and his God-fearing approach towards religions.
Well, yeah. I mean, what a pivotal figure in history.
Yeah.
Because he, this is the part of the program where I kind of repeat back what I heard to test my comprehension, and you correct me if I'm wrong. But he was basically commanded to eliminate the
Mhm.
Mormon leadership, and he refused to do so. And instead, he just encouraged them to keep moving, which was probably the best possible compromise given the gravity or the anger or the I don't know what
Disdain.
the disdain of the people of Missouri. So it's interesting that the people of Utah, the Mormon people, are grateful to Donovan for this, rather than he. I don't know what else he could have done given the situation.
No, no.
Yeah.
It was kind of a sticky situation. And I was wrong. It wasn't Brigham Young. It was Joseph Smith that was in there. Brigham Young went to
Oh,
visit Joseph Smith in jail. But
okay. Yeah. So yeah. I mean, when you think of course, the Mormon Church, you can't think of that without thinking of Utah. and here's this guy Donovan. Do you know why the street in El Paso is named after him? Is it just because of this, or?
it has nothing to do with the Mormon Church. I found out about this quite by accident because I've been very involved with establishing Keystone Heritage Park, which is on Donovan Drive.
Right.
I've been working on that for over almost 25 years.
Wow.
And when I saw the name Donovan, I said, well, what's this all about? Who is this Alexander Donovan person? And somebody said, well, check out what happened when the United States was kind of chasing the Mexicans out of the Mexican military out of what we now know as New Mexico and Texas. And as it turned out, being the leader of the militia in Missouri, he was commanded to round up the militia and work with a gentleman by the name of General Kearney. Now, General Kearney, if you've ever been to San Diego, you'll see Kearney Mesa, you see Kearney this, Kearney that. Kearney was a commanding officer of this particular battalion, and their edict was to march west to Santa Fe. Here comes Santa Fe again, and then head south down towards the Mexican border and chase the Mexican and the military out of the area because it was now belonged to us. We had purchased it, and he was second in command to Kearney. And Kearney, when they got to Santa Fe, used Donovan because Donovan learned how to speak and write Spanish when he was in school.
Wow.
And so he negotiated a settlement with the governor of New Spain, Mexico, in Santa Fe. They actually surrendered the territory to Kearney and Donovan without a shot being fired.
Wow.
And then what happened is Kearney took the bulk of his troops and continued marching west to California, while Donovan marched south towards El Paso del Norte, which is now Juarez. And along the way, they ran into a situation in what is now the area around Anthony, Texas. And they ran into a situation where the Mexican military was camped there. They had a small fortress, nothing formal, just a small little fortress that they had established to stop the insurgency of these evil Americans. And it was Christmas when Donovan was marching south with his troops, and he was vastly outnumbered, vastly outgunned. Certainly, the Mexican soldiers had wonderful uniforms, so everything was against Donovan as he marched. Well, one of the ideas he came up with was to drag bushes and things behind the troops, so it looked like there was a lot more military than there really was. And so the Christmas morning, when the Mexican soldiers woke up to all this dust coming around the bend, plus they had been celebrating Christmas Eve a little bit too much with cervezas, they weren't in a mood to fight to begin with. But then when they saw all this dust, they thought, oh, we've had it. Our number's been called. Well, what Donovan did is he lined up his troops in rows of three. And the first row would fire, and they would lay down on the ground and reload. It was the old rifles that they used, where they had to load the gunpowder in the muzzle and the whole enchilada.
Sure.
So they would lay down, they would reload. The second group would fire, they would lay down, they reload. They kept doing that. Well, the Mexicans thought they were killing them, and they weren't. I think there was like 7 injuries on the U.S. side. There was a few fatalities on the Mexican side. Well, the Mexicans realized these people can't be killed, so they continued marching south across the Rio Grande to get away from them.
Well, I love this because I think for our listeners now, every time we drive down Donovan, we're going to remember if we want our enemy to think that there's more of us than there are, we just need to drag branches behind us and pretend to die, and then we'll
Yeah, we should
scare
learn
them.
that in fighting wars. We should, behind the tanks and the trucks, we should drag bushes.
Yeah, exactly.
But
Exactly.
yeah, I was fascinated by that story, and then while I was reading the story, I found out about this relationship with the Mormon Church. I thought, well, this is a great story.
Yeah, very interesting. If you're just joining us, we're with historian Bernie Sargent. It's been fun because I've run into in the past few weeks a few people from I'll call it the history community here in El Paso, and I said, "Oh yeah, Bernie Sargent was on the program." They're like, "Oh yeah, Bernie." Everyone knows Bernie I think in the history community here in El Paso.
Yeah, kind of
But
my witness protection program.
yeah, you can run, but you can't hide. We found you. Really appreciate you coming on. We're going to take a break. Do not touch that dial.
We'll be right back. Don't touch that dial.
Are you looking for a Bible teaching church on the west side of El Paso? This is Terry Gray, pastor of Calvary Chapel Sun City and speaker on the Summons broadcast heard each weekday at 5 p.m. here on this station. Calvary Chapel Sun City is located at 960 West Borderland Road on the west side of El Paso. We hold services on Wednesday evenings at 7 and on Sunday mornings at 9 and 11. You can find out more information about us on the web at www.ccsuncity.org. The Lord bless you, my friends. Hey KLP listeners, this is Pastor Terry Gray of Calvary Chapel Sun City on El Paso's west side. I want to invite you to join me at a new time at 5 p.m. Monday through Friday right here on KELP. If you're driving home at 5 p.m. or doing work around the house or getting your evening started, I invite you to join me as we go through the Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. There is nothing more valuable than the Word of God, so let's invest our time in learning more about it together each day. That's our Bible study program, Summons, each weekday at 5 p.m. right here on KELP.
We're back. You're listening to 915 Talk.
And we're back. You're listening to 915 Talk. I'm your host, Andy Frecca. We're with Bernie Sargent today, discussing, well, all things El Paso, but especially the past, the history. I do believe it affects us today. We started off talking about Oñate, that controversial and pivotal figure in the history of El Paso. We started this conversation talking about the Mormon exodus from Mexico, but we ended up talking about Donovan Drive and Keystone Heritage Park. So I think this just proves the fact that all history is interconnected. But before we get back into this discussion of history, Bernie, tell me about Keystone Heritage Park. Why that was so important to you?
Oh yeah. Really, it's really exciting the way that whole thing developed. We had just moved to El Paso, and maybe a year after we got there, I saw these signs for a public meeting, and I thought, wonder what this is all about. And I went to the meeting, and it turned out that there was a big plot of land along Donovan that supposedly there was going to be an industrial site built there. No, I'm sorry. Let me digress. The railroad wanted to put a switching yard there. In other words, they have cars unloading and loading all day long, all night long. And I thought, wait a minute, we just moved here because it's kind of the ambiance is a little bit quiet and peaceful. And we lived on the west side. I thought, well, what can I do to help out? And lo and behold, I ended up becoming president of the Upper Valley Neighborhood Association.
Oh, wow.
So, careful what you ask for. But
right.
So we mounted an effort to stop the railroad, which is something that in Texas is just unheard of. But we wanted to do it in a peaceful way. We didn't want to, typically you see these people that they get rabid about things, and sometimes it works, but most of the times it doesn't. Well, we had a group of about 1,100 people join, a lot of whom were legal experts that lived not too far from where Keystone is right now. And so we tapped their legal expertise, and we mounted a positive effort to stop the railroad from putting a switching yard there. And then ultimately, we ended up negotiating to purchase a part of that land from the owner. Some of it he donated to the Archaeological Conservancy because it is significantly tied to archaeology in the United States, going back 4,500 years ago. And then there's also a wetlands there, which we thought, well, this is kind of cool. We've got a wetlands. Now we have an archaeological site. And my education is sales and marketing. So what can we do to market this piece of property so we could garner support and get visitors? And so we came up with the idea of having parks within a park. In other words, we'd celebrate the archaeology, we'd celebrate the anthropology, we'd celebrate the wildlife, the plant life, a little bit of everything for a lot of different passions. And we got a very sizable grant, and we were able to buy 52 acres from the landowner, coupled with the 6 acres that the city owned of archaeological site that was protected by the government, and another close to 6 acres that were owned by the landowner, and he donated that. And so we ended up with a total of 52 acres. And I thought, okay, now what do we do? And that's when we began planning, along with the Junior League and a few other organizations, the Rotaries, to develop Keystone Heritage Park. And the more I studied it and researched it, the more excited I got about the fact that we had this 4,500-year-old history here, that, you know, with people that lived along the Rio Grande, and that was their home. It was the early, not nomadic tribes, but stationary tribes that lived in areas for long periods of time instead of traveling as the weather changed. And we learned that there was over 40 of, we call them pit houses, but they're not really pit houses. They're little mounds of tree limbs and branches and mud to create their little living quarters. And learned a lot about the natives that lived in the area. And thought, well, this is fun. This is stuff we can share with the world. And that's how it really started. I think officially 24 years ago, when we named it the Keystone Archaeological Protection and Preservation Association. And, and
sounds like a title. Sounds like yeah, it sounds like the title of a book from the 1700s. Let's make it really long. But I had no idea that park was that big. I've driven past it many times. But it's a total of 58 acres.
Now it's 58, yeah, because the state has gone in and done a little bit more research and found a few more acres. 6 acres that was ultimately tied over to us that the city owned. So it's up to 58 acres now.
Well, I'm inspired. The next time I've never been inside, and I will rectify that glaring omission from my personal history the next time I'm down in the area. Walk around a bit.
Guy with no name along with you.
Mac Daddy always enjoys a stop in a park for a walk around. But I think it's a good just also encouragement for our audience. If you see something in the community that could be better, get at it. Don't just sit around. Things can change in a positive way, and as you said, like a confrontational way. Yeah. So super interesting.
One more little side thing, Andy, on the Keystone Park. When I talked about Alexander Donovan, when he traveled on this expedition out of Missouri, he took with him his brand new wife, and she was a couple years younger. She was still a teenager. They'd just been married a short time. And they had their own wagon. They had actually brought along carpet to put down so that they would have a place to sit and chat and so on. They were living the life of luxury. But so they traveled west, and when they got almost to what's called, I think it's called Bend, Colorado. There was a native tribe there, and they had a couple of slaves that they had captured, and one of them was a young boy that they captured from another tribe. And the gal, Donovan's wife, negotiated a exchange with that tribe to get the boy back to his family. When she first left Missouri, she was a very prim and proper religious individual. So to see partially naked, mostly naked natives was to her very shocking. But by the time she got to Santa Fe, she'd become kind of infatuated with them to the point where she was documenting everything as they traveled, trying to learn the languages, becoming a very big supporter of these natives and their forays, the way they lived. And she would, at the end of the day, when they would park their wagons, she would take her trunk off the back of the wagon, sit down on it, and she had a greyhound pet, a greyhound dog called Mr. Ring. And Mr. Ring would sit next to her, and she would write in her journal everything she saw that day. And they continued the trip down from Santa Fe down south. She had a couple of medical incidents that took place. Being a young married couple, they were trying to have children, and that wasn't working out for them. They got down to El Paso del Norte and spent a number of days at a ranch there, a rancho, and really loved the culture, loved the food, and wrote about it extensively. And then they traveled further southeast to Saltillo, and then over to the Gulf. And from the Gulf, they took a boat back to the Mississippi and back home. And her name was Susan Shelby McGoffin. And if you go to Keystone, you'll see the bronze statue of Susan Shelby McGoffin.
Wow. Yeah, I find this to be interesting because kind of similar to my comment about the journeys of Oñate and then him being called back to go to court. My impression of history so much is that the colonizers, the conquerors, whatever we would call them, were impervious of local tradition and culture. But it seems that that's not really the case for many people. Yeah, and in this story you're telling where they became quite fascinated, they began learning from the people they were meeting, which is different than my feeling that I got from learning history growing up.
Yeah, that's what I find most fun about history, is being able to share those stories, those little sidebars, the rabbit holes as they call them, because they become very, very interesting. I mentioned we can talk about this a little bit later. Oñate, in his travels, there were a number of Jewish participants in that expedition that had been chased out of Europe, ended up in Mexico, and then kind of disguised their Jewish faith to stay there, and then traveled with Oñate north, and they took their practices with them as they went up there. And we can talk about what ended up happening with them at a later time.
Yeah. So again, we've been with El Paso historian extraordinaire, the one, the only Bernie Sargent. Were you ever in the military, Bernie?
Yes, I was.
What was your rank?
Sergeant.
You were sergeant?
I was.
I had to ask. And for those who
it was brutal in basic training, I will tell you that.
Yeah.
Remembered my name.
Right. So good. And your name is spelled differently than the rank. But
yeah, that's a product of Ellis Island. When my family came over from Europe, they spelled it phonetically and not the way the military did.
Right. And Bernie, I'm inspired by all of your stories. I personally have started to read more about El Paso history. I'm enjoying it. Really appreciate your time today.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the invitation. I always love talking history. El Paso is my favorite history, and I'll talk to anybody.
Thanks again, Bernie. And we're running out of time. So as we always say, let's learn to love our city, love our neighbor, and give God all the glory. This has been 915 Talk. You have been listening to 915 Talk, a production of Desert Voice Media. In order to listen to previous editions of 915 Talk, just visit desertvoice.media. Let's learn together to love our city, love our neighbors, and give God all the glory.